Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Dr. Soul Brother here once again with a remedy to help cure your ill. We need to remember a man who made major sacrifices for on he made many sacrifices to help to make things different and better for his family and by extension his community and by further extension his country. And that is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this is why my show is titled Put Some Respect on Dr. King's Name. Because Dr. Soul Brother is really um, chopping at the bits over this latest outward disrespect towards Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I don't plan to be on here for a long period of time, but I want to get in as much as I can with the time that I have. It is downright sickening, disgusting, rude, and disrespectful for some of y'all to either be on social media out here in these streets, in these YouTube streets, internet streets, or just out here regular and disrespect Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But in order to understand this, I'm going to bring some things to your attention that you may or may not be aware of. Okay. First of all, he's somebody who needs to be recognized as a true patriot. Um, 'Cause he was a man who not only had the best interests of his people, he had the best interests of his country. If you go back to the 1960s, we know that I'm only have to go into his biographical sketch. You know, the fact that he was from Atlanta, came out of a middle class household. His father was a pastor. His grandfather was a pastor. And I think there may have been one or two other people who were in the ministry. So he followed that tradition. But Dr. King was also part of a radical tradition. Oh, yes. Dr. King was a radical. So again, you need to put some respect on his name. While he got involved in the civil rights movement in the 1950s, going into the 1960s, it was during the 1960s where, and this is going to be controversial, but I don't care. I can back it up. There were some people like the Nation of Islam under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad and by extension Malcolm X, who were on a crusade, if you will, to lambast black ministers and black folk who were civil rights leaders and uh, people who were active in the civil rights movement. Okay, and that I have a serious problem with. It's one thing to be critical and say, well, I disagree with your nonviolent tactic and all of that. Okay, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But what I do have a problem with is when a person or a people exhibit ingratitude for a person or people who make sacrifices to make the community, the society, and try to make the world a better place in which to live. And then on top of that, you are benefiting from those sacrifices that were made and you exhibit ingratitude. That is a problem. You are an ingrate. Here's the thing. Dr. King, while he was raised in a middle class environment, went on to become a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, was a Prince Hall Mason, and yes, Dr. King was a member of the Boule. Okay, that's important to know and understand. I'm letting that. marinate for a moment. Um, Look, anyone like Dr. King who had those affiliations couldn't possibly have been an enemy to our people. None. Okay? And I'm gonna keep um drilling this till some of y'all get this through your thick skulls. Those institutions served as a bridge over troubled waters. So when people like the Nation of Islam, again, under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad and by extension Malcolm X, who was a minister and became a national spokesman for the Nation of Islam, they were on a crusade, if you will, to go in on the black church and by extension the civil rights movement. I want some of y'all to explain to me, how is it and why is it that here's a man like Dr. King, while he was an integrationist, to be sure, I mean, that was clear. Someone, on the other hand, like an Elijah Muhammad, who purported to have been a racial separatist, purported, that's the operative word, purported. Explain to me, how is it and why is it he was living in an exclusive white neighborhood simultaneously as he was going in on Dr. King and the civil rights movement? I want y'all to explain that to me. Huh? Explain that. I'll wait. I will wait. I can't wait for y'all to engage me in the comments section and explain that. You don't see that that's a contradiction? Not the fact that you're living in an exclusive neighborhood in and of itself, but simultaneously you purport to be a racial separatist. And yet Dr. King um, was living in a black neighborhood. And not only that, let's move forward. Here's a man who left the South temporarily and moved to Illinois. Well, let me back up. Let me back up. Before I get there, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to something here. That's. Let me not get ahead of myself. I'll go back to that in a minute. Give me a second. I'll go back to that. I promise. But here's the thing: when Malcolm X was assassinated, before Malcolm X was assassinated, actually, we know the story about how he um, went through a metamorphosis. He apologized publicly for going in on black leaders as well as the black ministers. The problem was the damage had been done. While I salute him for um, trying to course correct, the damage had been done to the point where some of these folks, and you know who you are, seniors, you're in your 70s and 80s right now, who were young Turks at the time, who were following Malcolm X. And again, this is not a diss on Malcolm. I love me some Malcolm X. But at the same time, I have to look at this thing for what it is. Here's the deal. This man came along and got assassinated, and some months, that was February 1965. Some months later, in August of 65, you had what was known as the Watts Rebellion of 1965 in California. And Dr. King comes to Los Angeles to speak to the people. If you go on YouTube, you will see archival footage of Dr. King. There's a Bayard Rustin standing with him, trying to maintain order with the crowd because pretty much didn't want to hear what Dr. King had to say. Why? Because they had been heavily influenced by the NOI. That's a fact because Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X were going around lampooning black ministers. Okay? Let's understand this. And so this is what Dr. King was running into. So a year later, in 66, he moves to um, Chicago, south side of Chicago, okay, living in the ghetto among the people. This is middle class Dr. King. This is Dr. King, PhD. This is um, Mr. Alpha Phi Alpha, Prince Hall Mason, Boule, etc., living among the people. And he was trying to help black folks move to um, fighting against discrimination in housing in a place called Cicero, Illinois, which, by his own admission, uh, the hostility and anger and hatred that he received there in Chicago was far worse than what he'd received in Mississippi, Alabama, and other parts of the South. That's heavy. And let's be clear, those white folks who were exhibiting that kind of hatred and hostility, most of them were not Southern. In fact, many of them were first generation, in some cases, second generation, removed from Europe. Let's be clear. Okay? Let me continue. So, Dr. King, for all intents and purposes, at that moment, committed class suicide, to borrow from Emil Carl Cabral. Um, Elijah Muhammad didn't do that. Nation of Islam didn't do that. They're right there in Chicago. Come on, fam, we got to think, man, think. So, the young people who were kind of cool towards Dr. King as it related to his philosophy and all that. And again, you can disagree. You're free to disagree with somebody's political philosophy. Again, I have no problem with that. But when you begin to exhibit disrespect towards a man who put his life on the line, he was in the trenches. You're out of order and you've gone too far. Let me continue because Dr. King, as we know, spoke out against the Vietnam War in 1967, and that's what helped to put him in the doghouse with a lot of people, white as well as some black folk, truth be told. But going into 1968, Dr. King did two things. Number one, he stood shoulder to shoulder with those brothers who were sanitation workers, who were on a sanitation strike because they were getting paid pittance, money that they were eking out a living. You could hardly survive off of those wages. And by the way, let's be clear. If you are a sanitation worker today, your salary, I don't care what part of the country we're talking, your salary is not like it was back then. And that's because of the blood, sweat, and tears of folk who got rolled their uh, um, sleeves up and put their shoulder to the wheel and pulled, as my grandmother would say. That's why. And also, if you want to look down upon people who do that kind of work, you are nothing but a straight up elitist. But let me move on. Um, this is a man who loved his country, who was a true patriot, and wanted to make it live up to its ideals. Remember what he talked about? America, all we're saying is be true to what you said on paper. He was not satisfied with um, being this middle class minister, living in a middle class neighborhood. He could have very easily, after he got his PhD there in Massachusetts, he could have lived up north and gotten a position as a college professor, but that wasn't him. No shade on those who lived there, but I'm just saying he could have chosen to do that, but he didn't. And let's remember now, while Dr. King was a middle class minister and lived a middle class life growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, remember now, he had rural roots. Daddy King, affectionately known, that was his father, Martin Luther King Sr., aka Daddy King. While he was a Morehouse man and was a minister, this is a man who came from Stockbridge, Georgia, which is the rural part of Georgia. In other words, he was from the country. And if you listen to Dr. King's cadence, in a lot of ways, you can hear, even though you can distinguish him from, say, a person who's from a rural area, and certainly you can distinguish him from, say, a person who has less formal education. Um, some of his cadence, if you listen carefully, you can tell that Dr. King come from uh, rural roots. For example, you watch the documentary Eyes on the Prize. I'm struck by two things. One, I forgot what part of the South this was when there were people who were in jail. And he asked the person, how much is that? How many people is that cell supposed to hold? And he said, it's it's made for, I can't remember the exact words, but basically it's been a long time since I've watched it. But basically there were more people in the cell than they were packed in like sardines. But the way in which he was talking in that moment which would be referred to as a relaxed speech, that indicated his family background. Okay, especially when he was speaking with a or to a black audience. Okay, you could hear that. But here's the thing: he was one of us, and he was truly a soul brother. He dug soul food. He uh, dug soul music. Okay, he um, liked to shoot pool. He could dance. Said he could cut. He could get it in on the dance floor. And he liked him some Mahalia Jackson gospel, and liked him some Aretha Franklin soul singer. Okay, so Dr. King was one of us, and he declared that black is beautiful. What did he say? No longer shall we be ashamed of being black. And you can hear somebody on and say, go ahead, tell it, doctor. And what does Dr. King say? Black is beautiful. Okay, this was Christian Dr. King, Christian minister Dr. King. Don't get it twisted. Okay, no. So, um, this is a man who was one of us. He was a soul brother. This is a man who put his life on the line. This is the man who paid the ultimate price when it comes to struggle. And for you to dare come on the scene now, you bunch of ingrates, to turn around and be disrespectful to Dr. King and say he screwed things up, let me tell you something right now. How dare you? How dare you come on the scene? And this is the thing: those folk back in the 1960s who were throwing shade on Dr. King, they're the ones who jump started this madness. I'm talking to you, senior folk who are in your 70s and 80s, and you know who you are. You caused this mess. You caused this. This is awful. And so when you see people who came through, let's say in the 1980s and 90s, and had a dim view of Dr. King. They got that from folks who were old enough to be their parents. And fast forward to now. Here we are, 2024, and you got people, young folks who weren't even a thought of and weren't even born, who one could argue would be the grandchildren of those young Turks who were talking that madness back in the 1960s. Now they have developed disdain and contempt for a man again who made the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate. This is a shame. This really is. And I'm gonna tell you something. Um, we're gonna pay for this. Okay? Look at the who would have thought? Now, there was a man named Robert F. or is a man named Robert F. Smith, who's a donor, black man who paid the loans for those brothers who graduated from Morehouse College. Remember him? Well, he made a donation that allowed the Park Service to preserve Martin Luther King's home. This was maybe 5 years ago, somewhere thereabout. Fast forward to now. Who would have thought that a few months ago, a young 26-year-old arsonist by the name of Lanisha Chantrice Henderson, you remember her? Who took some, was using gasoline. Listen to this, in broad daylight, gasoline, and was using it to douse Dr. King's home, the house he was raised in. That is his historical site. And thank God for those bystanders who came along and accosted her until the cops came, and then she was arrested and put in jail. If that hadn't have happened, if those bystanders had not have been there, that house would have been set afire. That is visceral hatred. And the thing is this: one can say, well, she's mental health issues. Well, one could argue that some of y'all out here who want to go in on Dr. King, y'all got some mental health issues. That ain't normal. That is not normal. So in closing, I will say this. Remember Dr. King? This man, I'm going to say this to these young folks who are under my voice. Listen to me and listen to me carefully. Dr. King had his imperfections like any other human being. Okay? He did. In spite of that, in fact, in many ways, it becomes a moot point in this case. This is a man who, again, paid the ultimate price when it came to freedom, justice, and equality. And he did not screw things up. It is not integration per se that screwed things up. What it was, which is a conversation for another day, to those seniors, y'all know who you are. in your 70s and 80s, a combination of the silent generation and well as the what they call them, um, baby boomers, who were flirting with and were seduced by white counterculture. And you all, and some of you adopted that stuff from a distance. By that I mean, I'm talking about those who were in black communities, in black spaces, like what you saw from a distance, whether it's uh, Haight Ashbury in San Francisco or Greenwich Village in New York, and you adopted that stuff. That is what had an effect on the black community, not integration per se. Because think about this. If you are, let's say this is between 1960 and 1965, and you move into a predominantly white neighborhood, the vast majority of white folks living in that neighborhood had conservative values, irrespective of political affiliation. In other words, they could have been Democrats or Republicans. That was but what started to happen was when the counterculture come on the scene, that created a paradigm shift. But again, I'm not going to go into that because that is a conversation and a discussion for another day. It's a program for another day. And at some point in the not too distant future, I intend to deal with that. So remember who Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was. Remember, he is a man who made the ultimate sacrifice. And I'm going to go into this and say this. Andy Young, if you watch the documentary King in the Wilderness, which was a HBO documentary, he talked about it, said that the anti-war movement was a new constituency uh, for us, and there was a spiritual connectedness that they were comfortable with. He said they wanted to emulate our tactics. Hear this, but there were radical elements of violence and anti-American discussion, and we didn't want him, meaning Dr. King, taking his moral position into an extreme left environment with kids who were kind of anti American, who were communists, who were burning the American flag. And we could not control that. That's Andy Young. That's very profound. Why? Because Dr. King, while he was critical of his country, he was not about this is not my country. If anything, his sentiments uh, um, echoed the sentiments of Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions. This is my country. Y'all heard me talk about that song, okay? And to you, senior citizens who are in your 70s and 80s, you were alive when that song came out. And I would respectfully suggest that you might want to listen to that song again, okay? So you can be critical of the United States, but not point a condemnatory finger to the point where you decide to mentally and socially and politically and all the rest of it check out. Dr. King was not about that. So I'm gonna end my program here with the very words of our brother Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he said, this was in the 1960s. He said, quote, I want young men and young women who are not alive today, but who will come into this world with new privileges and new opportunities. I want them to know and see that these new privileges and new opportunities did not come without somebody suffering and sacrificing for them. End of quote. That's our brother, Dr. King. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, please comment, and until the next time, God bless. And again, remember, put some respect on the name of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.